Okay, here we go. Study session of September 14th, 2021 is called to order. Donna, you do a roll call, please?
Yes, I will. Deputy Mayor Peterson. Councilmember Bode.
Here.
Councilmember Inesco.
Here.
Mayor Dorsey.
Here.
Councilmember Feast.
Here.
Councilmember McDowell.
Present.
And Councilmember Schmidt.
Here.
All right, thank you. So for our study session tonight, we have City Engineer Ken Gill with information for us regarding the local road safety plan.
Good evening, council. It's good to see your smiling faces, and even if it is in Zoomville. But it's hope you're getting out and enjoying the last of this fall weather. So we're using it taking it to our advantage to take care of some paving projects. But that's not the topic tonight. The topic
And it's still summer. We're gonna hold on to this for another 8 days.
You know, I'd be lying to you, Councilmember, if I told you that was going to happen. It's scheduled to start pouring down rain on Friday, so that's why we're chip sealing tomorrow. So, so I would love to say you are 100% correct, but I'd be lying to you if I told you it wasn't going to start raining soon. So, the topic tonight is something that I'm really kind of excited about. And I know we've been working on this for a long time because I presented it to you quite a few months ago, but it's our local road safety plan. And I want to introduce you to our consultant, Ryan Shea. Ryan grew up in Tenino, graduated from St. Martin's University with a degree in math, and has been a transportation planner for Shea Cargill for the past 15 years. So also Ryan has a unique Shelton connection, and then he spent the summer of 2004 working at the Simpson Lumber Mill. So I will turn it over to Ryan and let him tell you what he's been up to the past 3 months. Take it away, Ryan.
Thanks. I'm happy to be here. I'm excited to kind of share the progress we've been making over the summer on this local road safety plan. So let me share my screen. I assume that everyone can see the slideshow. Okay. So we started this process. Ken reached out to us in the spring about providing a local road safety plan. And just to get things started, as he mentioned, my name is Ryan Shea. I work with SCJ Alliance. And I'm hoping that this presentation can kind of be interactive. I would hope that if at any point any of you have questions, feel free to just interrupt me and kind of voice them, and we'll deal with them. Or if I have an answer later, then I'll kind of ask you to wait for me, but feel free to interact. At the moment, we're just trying to present the information that we have right now. And honestly, we're trying to get as much local input as far as on the ground concerns and experiences as we can before we get anything formally published. So any local knowledge that any of you have regarding safety, we're eager to mine that knowledge. But for today, I'm going to walk through kind of what a local road safety plan is, talk about the crash history for the city, and then kind of walk through the process of determining risk factors and priority corridors, and then potential countermeasures. So with that, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the term local road safety plan, but yeah, the idea behind it is that it's allowing a city or a public agency, counties, states, they can happen at all levels, to kind of take a data-driven analysis approach to safety and specifically focus on fatal and serious injury crashes. I know that's kind of been a bigger and bigger priority, and Target Zero being a statewide program is really focused on trying to reduce and eliminate fatal and serious injury crash types. The data that we get for this process is provided by WashDOT, and really it just kind of whenever a crash occurs, police report to the scene, they file an incident report that gets collected by WashDOT. WashDOT maintains a statewide database of any and all reported crashes in the state, which they make available to, anybody. And we've solicited the last 5 years of crash data to try to get a representative snapshot of what's happening in the city. And I would say too that while the data set's pretty robust, it only contains crashes that were reported. There are unlikely to be crashes that occurred that were not reported. And even more specifically, everyone's got those near miss experiences that weren't actual crashes, but were very scary and could have potentially resulted in a significant crash. And that's the sort of gap in the data we get from WashDOT that is another element that we're hoping, if there's any sorts of stories like that any of you have heard about or experienced personally, that knowing about those and where they occurred to make sure that we're not missing a spot in the city that might potentially be dangerous. And I would also just take this moment to kind of explain that let me just jump to the next slide, actually. We're going to use this plan to help understand the safety issues in the city and kind of help determine priorities. The way that a local road safety plan works is it attempts to find system-wide or systemic problems. And then if you can do that, you can understand locations that may or may not have had a serious or fatal crash, but that have the conditions that maybe make it dangerous without having that crash occur yet. So, over the last few decades, safety investments have primarily been focused on spot improvements. So you've had a fatal or serious crash, and so that's a problem spot. So you find money and you fix that spot. And over time, it was kind of found that while this investment was occurring, that the number of serious and fatal crashes wasn't really dropping. And one of the conclusions that was drawn from that is that the contributing circumstances, the characteristics of the road or the intersection at these locations where serious or fatal crashes occur matter, but maybe the individual locations are a little bit random. So instead of only focusing on spots where crashes have already occurred, this idea of trying to step back and figure out, well, given these 4 conditions, we know that those conditions were present at the fatal and serious crashes we've seen. Where else in our system are those conditions present? And maybe looking at a systemic solution that addresses those spots that have and have not had serious or fatal crashes can be a more proactive approach. And that's kind of the main focus of the local road safety plan process. And WashDOT's been involved in this process with us, and they oversee or record and gather all these plans. And for them especially, they made sure to emphasize that the systemic element of these plans is really key in finding those themes where conditions are unsafe, and then finding solutions that can be matched to spots before or after a fatal or serious accident has occurred. And as an example of what I kind of mean by system-wide or systemic solutions, and it would, in a more rural setting, like a county setting where there's a lot of high-speed roads that may or may not have adequate street lighting, you might find out that we've had 4 serious fatal crashes, and they've occurred in instances where there's high speeds and not a lot of lighting. So rather than just put lighting in at those 4 spots, kind of taking a step back and saying, well, we need to get lighting on all these roads where these conditions are the same, because any of these other locations could have been the next spot for a fatal or serious crash. But that doesn't mean we ignore the spots where they've already happened. Obviously, those are unsafe too. And those can get a lot more specific to the condition. And as the example I list here is, if you have an issue with speeding, I know a nice treatment that can be considered is having a raised intersection tabletop. If any of you have driven through St. Martin's University, there's several of those throughout the main campus there where the entire intersection is raised a few inches, and it really does a good job of controlling speeds. And that's just an example. I mean, obviously, every specific spot has a set of circumstances that make a certain type of fix the most appropriate. And then the outcome of the local road safety plan, in addition to getting an idea of where your needs are as a city, it also helps prioritize projects and be ready for funding. A lot of times when you want to go for funding, having this local road safety plan is a huge part of competing well for funding. So that's kind of an overview of what the local road safety plan is and kind of what it's aiming to achieve. If there aren't any immediate questions, I can jump into kind of the existing crash data that the city of Shelton has had. So on screen right now is a heat map of the 832 reported crashes over the last 5 years. And the red spots would indicate a more of a density of crashes where there was a lot more focused in a specific area. So you can see kind of throughout the city where the higher concentrations of crashes have occurred, and Railroad and First is, I think, the spot that jumps out the most. That being the State Route 3 through town, I guess it's not too surprising that there's likely a lot more traffic there. And I would expect that you would all recognize that all these main corridors where you see the consistent trail of red and blue, those are kind of the main corridors in town. And as you have more volume, you're going to have more crashes. We didn't specifically dig into crash rates for this effort. We were focused more on the individual serious fatal crashes. And that's kind of what's driving the overall goals of this plan, but it's still good to know where the overall crash tendencies are. And so among those 832 crashes, there were 16 that were either fatal or serious injury crashes, which was about 2%. And overall, that's not necessarily out of line with other communities, but still 16 is a lot. And I will just say too, that fatal target zero and all these policies that are focusing on reducing deaths, there were 2 fatals in the city of Shelton, but it's widely accepted or understood that serious injuries were just the short step away from fatal. And so while those aren't fatalities in and of themselves, they're considered in the same category because they were so close to being fatalities. And so the next graphic, before I get to a map that shows the serious and fatal crashes, when we looking at the entirety of the crash data for the city, one of the first things we did was assign each crash to the main roadway corridor. And then once we did that, we then went through and ranked the corridors by total crashes. So on the table, you can see right now is the top, it's 20 overall, it's 2 slides. This is roughly the top 10 corridors in the city just based on total crashes. Again, this is not the crux of the plan, but it certainly contributes to where we decide the needs are, just the overall crash tendencies. And, these are the same roadway sections that if we were to go back a slide, you would have seen in the blue and or the red. One thing that's not shown in this table breaks down the type of crashes, but what it doesn't show is the length of the corridor. So as you would expect, the longer a corridor, the more pavement, the more opportunity for crashes. So the longer corridors would often have the most crashes. Although despite that, the corridor on the top of the list, First Street between Mill Street and Railroad Ave, is one of the shortest corridors on this list, and it is number 1 anyway. So not only is it a high crash corridor, but it's also shorter than a lot of the ones below it, which means it's a very concentrated corridor of crashes, which bears out in that slide before where you can see that this entire corridor is fairly red versus other corridors that have a lot of blue. So just kind of dissecting and kind of presenting the overall, crash history of the city. We spent a fair amount of time during the summer kind of reviewing this and trying to understand themes and trends. The next slide shows the bottom half of the top 20. There's nothing magical about deciding that 20 corridors need to be focused on. It was just kind of a fairly natural stopping point for us because that's where we got to 2 crashes a year or higher. There are 20 corridors in the city that are averaging 2 crashes a year or more. And that's kind of where we decided to break it off. And then getting into so this slide here, this graphic to the right shows the location of each of the serious or fatal crashes. And the 2 fatal collisions are shown in red. And then the 14 that were serious injury crashes are shown in orange. And right away, one of the first takeaways we got from all of this was that of the 16 fatal serious crashes that occurred, 10 of them involved a pedestrian or a bicyclist. And that stood out immediately as a major trend. Both of the fatalities involved a bicycle or pedestrian, and most of the serious injury crashes. And it's not hard to understand that those are especially vulnerable members of the roadway. And so when they're involved in any crash, the odds of it becoming a serious or fatal are much higher than two vehicles. But even with that, this was much higher than like you would maybe see in other jurisdictions. So without having finished the process, we immediately assumed that this would be a focus of the study. And so because of that, the next slide, we went ahead and kind of mapped out all of the all of the crashes that involved a bike or a pedestrian. There were many that weren't serious and fatal, but understanding the vulnerability of those users, we felt that any of those could have fairly easily escalated in different circumstances. And you can kind of see that, like for instance, at First and Railroad, there's essentially 7 in a pretty condensed area there, and that was just a higher concentration of crashes overall, also a higher concentration of bike ped crashes. That's also kind of downtown where you would see maybe more pedestrian activity. And just in general, most of these crashes occur on what are generally the more, main corridors of the community. So that wasn't altogether surprising, but it just kind of shows the correlation between where these crashes are happening and kind of where the broader crash tendencies are. So that's kind of an overview of the crash history for Shelton. And that, again, that's the last 5 years. And again, that's the reported crashes. It doesn't include crashes that may not have been reported, or certainly not the near miss crashes that people experience. I can continue going through, or if there aren't any questions or comments at this time.
I have a quick question.
Oh, sure.
I think it's great that we're out here looking for safety issues. Do we know how many of these accidents were due to under the influence at all?
Yeah, no, we do know that. I don't know if I have a slide specific to that, but yes, as part of the WashDOT crash data database that we're given, if the police officer reporting to the scene suspected or had evidence of alcohol or drugs, it's noted on the crash report. And it is, as I'm going to get to next in terms of discussing risk factors, that was one of the factors we were anticipating potentially seeing. And as a small jump ahead, it wasn't present very often. And in these 16 crashes, I think we may have had 2 that had an alcohol or drug association to it. Those are obviously not things we can design around so much. Maybe there's different ways to deal with that with enforcement, but yeah, that is a data point that we have. So once we kind of went through and looked at the crash history of the city overall and kind of narrowed in on the serious and fatal crashes, the next step of the process is really breaking down each of the serious and fatal crashes and identifying the contributing circumstances or the roadway conditions that were present at each of those crashes. And those were kind of referred to as risk factors, elements that seem to potentially have been contributing to a serious or fatal crash. So the process of a local road safety plan is to kind of go through and individually identify those risk factors for each crash. And then when you've done that, you create a matrix where you identify how many instances did each risk factor occur for. And the methodology kind of outlines that if you have any risk factor that shows up in 25% or more of your serious fatal crashes, becomes like a priority risk factor for that community. So we start to look for trends across the different serious fatal crashes. And then once we did that process, we came up with these as our high priority risk factors. And kind of going back to what I was discussing a little bit ago, hitting a pedestrian or inattentive pedestrian crashes located along roadways. What I would say, it wasn't surprising that pedestrian and bicycle elements were prevalent in this list because so many of the fatal serious crashes involves bikes or peds. But what was a little surprising was that we really weren't finding any other risk factors that were consistent across the crashes. In the city, almost all the roads are low speed, so there wasn't really a high speed element to consider. I mean, a lot of these were on straight level roads, which is true for most of the city. Some were at intersections, some weren't. But again, there was no detailed distinction between these crashes, except that many of them involved bikes and peds. So as we were we went through a couple times because we were just really trying to make sure we weren't missing something more broad. And there really didn't seem to be any themes to these 16 serious fatal crashes, except that many of them involved the pedestrians and bicyclists. And so the next step in this process is typically to take your risk factors and then kind of apply them to your top corridors. So you say, okay, if these are the 5 risk factors that this city has, let's see which of our corridors that have a lot of crashes, which of these corridors have those risk factors. And then those can start to be priority locations for potential systemic improvements. Well, the fact that in this data set, really the only common trend was bike ped, involvement. We felt like really that means let's go back to that map of all the bike and ped crashes, understanding that the serious fatal ones were already bad, but any incident involving a bike or a ped could pretty quickly turn into a serious or fatal crash. And then kind of match that with our list of corridors that we showed above. And so kind of doing that, you can see the graphic is the one I showed previously, but also outlining kind of what feels like the priority corridors based on the location of the bike ped crashes, and also kind of referencing that corridor list from before. The 6 corridors that we identify here are all in the top 10 for total crashes in the city, but they also have the predominant number of bicycle pedestrian related incidents, including the vast majority of the serious and fatal pedestrian incidents. And so this is kind of where we were shifting from what we've done to kind of what we're working through right now. So this slide called preliminary, we're honing in on this at still, and this is why this is a good time to check in with you, because if there's additional input or knowledge or insight on other areas of the city in addition to these, we want to make sure to capture that before we go too much farther. But this is kind of where we're zooming in on what we would consider the high priority corridors in the city, all of which would have a focus on finding ways to improve bicycle or pedestrian safety. And then we have received some additional input beyond just the data we got from WashDOT. There have been some local citizens that have, in the last year or so, or even more recently, kind of reached out to the city. And Ken and Jay have both been really good about sharing any and all of those testimonies with us as they get them. So there's actually been, 4 local stakeholder inputs, and they're listed here. Arcadia Avenue and K Street were both related to speeding and or school friction, which both have a strong pedestrian element. I know that for the Arcadia Avenue, the woman who was sending in her concerns was specifically talking about pedestrian concerns. The school is 1 block north of them. So both of those really kind of play into the broader themes of what we're seeing, which is that pedestrian safety is kind of a top priority here. And then Pine Street and Railroad Avenue were identified as roads where sight distance can be an issue. And then in the Capitol Hill area, just the gravel roads there are steep and dusty, which can also have an element of sight distance problems. And so those are all things that we're kind of incorporating into what do we want to call the priorities for this plan. And potentially there's a high priority list and then maybe a secondary list, which identifies additional needs, but maybe not at the same priority level. That's kind of the process that we're in right now, but we certainly are open to and trying to get as much information as we can beyond what we have from WashDOT as far as other areas that we should be looking at or considering as we kind of move forward with this plan. And so I guess this would be a good time, I think, to just ask that question of you as a group, and if there's any testimonies or stories or known areas of concern that any of you have or hear about, it'd be great to hear those now. And if you think of them later, or if you hear about them, we're not finishing this tomorrow, but this is kind of one of the main things we were hoping to get from this presentation.
My main area of concern, and I've been talking about it for years, is outside of our junior high school, where we have 4 lanes of traffic and a crosswalk with a flashing light, and one car will stop when a kid starts crossing the street and the next car won't. And I'm surprised that nobody's been hit there. I actually have a video from like a year and a half ago. I was there 5 minutes and watched a car almost hit a kid, and where the kid actually made contact with the car. So that's just right across the street from our middle school. And then, of course, we have a new grade school, or Mountain View School, that does not have a crosswalk right in front of the school. It's a block away, one direction, a block the other direction. So I think the school should put in a crosswalk there, or a ADA ramp, so the city could put a crosswalk in there.
Yeah, and the Mountain View example was one of the specific examples that was raised. That's this East Street afternoon school traffic friction. Definitely, there's people living right there that are kind of just in terror of what's going to happen if changes aren't made. From what they see, they describe it as quite chaotic, and the lack of a crosswalk was specifically mentioned. And then but I hadn't heard anything about the junior high crosswalk. And as we'll get to later, in terms of countermeasures, signalizing crosswalks is definitely can be one of the ways to make them safer, but enforcement is key on that too. So the fact that it's already got some amount of flashing lights suggests that that's not enough, and there are ways to enhance or improve that even more. So that's definitely a good one to know.
I'll second the comments on crosswalks. I'm not a big fan of crosswalks across multiple lanes like we have on some of our busier roads, like Wallace Nealon there. It's like a 4-lane section of road there without any. I'm curious if pedestrian refuge islands are a concept as well that might work in the city of Shelton in some of those higher areas. So at least somebody makes it halfway across the road. They're not still standing out in the middle of traffic on a 4-lane roadway. And then I like the concept and would be very supportive of, especially on especially using the data points that you have of looking at the bump out scenario. So I do know, especially downtown on Railroad, it is challenging. You have to kind of step out behind parked vehicles to be seen, so you can show intent to cross the road, so you can get access to cross without getting hit by a vehicle. So concepts like that, I'm absolutely for planning those investments with the data presented. The only thing I didn't hear, and you may have mentioned it, I apologize. How much is this seasonal or related to weather? I believe you get environmental data with your crash statistics. I'm just curious if there's a time of the year that's more prevalent than the others. I think I kind of know the answer to the question, but I'm curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah. First, I'll say that you've identified some of the countermeasures that I'm going to show in a little bit. So that's great. That data, both the time of year and the weather conditions, are in the data set. We did look at the weather conditions as a potential factor and didn't see a lot of commonality among the serious fatals. We did not look at time of year. We looked at daylight, evening, until lighting, which is time of day, and obviously times of year have more dark versus less dark. And so we looked at lighting and weather, and I would say that time of year kind of informs both of those, but we didn't specifically look at that. So that's something that we can go back and look at, because now that you've said it out loud, I'm instantly curious if there are some themes there on time of year. I'm not sure where that would lead, but if there's any themes at all, we would want to know them.
Yeah, I would definitely think that roadway lighting improvements, as well as, if it's a snow and ice level of service thing, if we know that there's going to be people crossing the roadway in a snowstorm, And, especially if it's a bike ped incident, it'd probably be something we would focus level of service on. So even if it's just an operational thing and not so much a capital improvement or replacement of an asset, I think it would be helpful.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. And it won't be hard to sift the data for that and see what that shows us. Were there any other, I think.
Yeah, Brian, if I may.
Yeah.
Hi. So the other thing that I wanted to talk about, which Joe touched on, is the downtown core. And so one of the issues that I hear frequently from pedestrians in that area is that when the city took out the stoplight at 4th and Railroad, that used to be kind of the safe cross for folks mid-block, right, I guess mid-railroad. And so we see a lot of pedestrian traffic going to the post office, particularly around the lunch hour or near the end of the day. And so as folks are crossing at 3rd, we've had requests for flags on sticks that people can walk themselves across the road, or flashers, or some other mechanism to, again, as Joe pointed to, gain attention from the passing traffic. But the other piece of that being that while we have bulb outs on some of the downtown intersections, because the parking spaces aren't offset quite far enough, when traffic is at that corner, they tend to creep up to be able to see what's going on Railroad from a side street. And so the pedestrians are then losing that visibility. And so that may be something we need to take a look at, as well as how the parking stalls planning plays into pedestrian traffic patterns in the downtown core.
Yeah, so one of the things that we looked at was trying to assess pedestrian generators or attractors, or like main hubs of pedestrian activity. And just, looking at these corridors, it was kind of hard to decide, well, from this block to this block, there aren't any. Along these major corridors, there seemed to be a fairly consistent presence of something that might result in a PED activity. But it's really good to know that the post office is specifically one that sounds like it generates a lot of pedestrian activity crossing Railroad. So and then the fact that they used to have a safe crossing, and then now maybe they don't have that controlled crossing. That's and so, going back to the beginning when I was talking about systemic improvements and then potentially spot improvements, the plan is going to look at doing both. And so systemic improvements, we can identify some basic themes that could work on these corridors, but it's specific spot areas like that, even though there hasn't been a serious fatal crash at Railroad 3rd or Railroad 4th, that could easily be a spot improvement that we identify that there's a need for a protected crossing here. And that would be a spot improvement recommendation that would go kind of outside of the systemic improvements that we would recommend. And that could be tailored then specifically to that need. So definitely going to make a note of that as a specific spot that could be a good candidate for an improvement. So yeah, that's great. I want to allow everyone to share. So if there's anything else anybody wanted to say, please feel free.
Mr. Mayor, you're on mute.
Sorry. I was on mute. Sorry, Ryan. I don't know if you've seen this or heard about this or whatnot, but there was a lengthy email here a few weeks ago. And I'm not sure all the council members got it, but I got it, and is referring to Mountain View School. And the line of cars that are there every morning dropping off kids. And it might be something to look at as far as making like a turn lane there or something. I think there might be enough room, but you might look at
that. Ken was, I think, very prompt in sharing that with me when it was sent to the city,
Okay.
or whenever he got it. And that was the E Street bullet on this slide was in response to that email.
Okay.
And, yeah, reading that email carefully, it's clear that, at least from the perspective of who wrote it, it's really bad when school is letting out.
Yes.
And just kind of from my own personal experience, I've worked on several elementary schools where and this is I know a recent redesign, but over the past 15 years, there's been this big trend away from bus use and to parent drop off pickup. And that has overwhelmed a lot of these schools' ability to, manage that pickup and drop off activity. They just don't have the room on site because these sites were kind of designed primarily when that wasn't nearly as common. And there's a lot of ways that you can start to tackle that issue depending on the circumstances, whether that's an on-site solution with more circulating pavement where you can store more of the cars there, or if there's also a street improvement like a turn lane. Because I know one of the things that I think Joe mentioned it too, or Eric, was the idea that when one car is there kind of stopped, it kind of gridlocks the road really quickly. There's no refuge for anybody to sit aside and wait. So it doesn't take a lot of congestion to really create a dangerous environment, especially when you also have kids walking home. So yeah, I think that seems to clearly be a priority location. And I think that we're going to continue to work with the city on figuring out what improvement or improvements might make sense to specifically recommend. Or it might be that given the complexity of what might be causing the problem, that it needs to be studied a little bit more specifically, and then to determine some improvements that way.
Were there a lot of crashes that were just one car collisions, not car versus car, or something else?
Yeah, I mean,
somebody running into one of our stop signs or something like that.
In terms of in terms of the overall crash data, there were many of those. In terms of the 16 that we're kind of, we're focusing more on, which are the serious and the fatal, there were a couple that were kind of isolated one vehicle incidents. A lot of them were one vehicle and then a pedestrian. But in terms of excluding those, there were a couple. And I think that kind of speaks to why we didn't see other themes, because a lot of those crashes that didn't involve a ped or a bike were these kind of one-off incidents where they strayed off the road and hit a pole, or they were under the influence of alcohol. I mean, there wasn't a consistent factor in those crashes because they just all seemed to be one-off incidents, other than obviously the main theme of pedestrian bicycle involvement. Which I guess is good in a way. It means that maybe not all those areas are unsafe, but obviously we look for those themes to help guide the spending, and whether or not there are other themes that just weren't present in the last 5 years. Clearly pedestrian and bicycle safety is kind of the main concern at the moment, but there weren't other themes present.
The overall, I'm looking through the data that you have on your presentation, and the top 5 or whatever their first and 3 Olympic Highway North. Predominantly these are rear-ender collisions, which in my opinion, and I'm not a traffic engineer by any means, but we did go through and do a compact roundabout in Shelton, and removing those conflict points in an intersection prevent those types of accidents, those rear-ender collisions. And so again, I think, the other piece of this, and not downplaying the data at all, because, this is definitely important. Roadway safety is incredibly important, but, all of these routes, I guess the positive part is, these are all of our, pretty much all of it looks like principal arterials in the city. These are our highly traveled routes. We have the highest amounts of traffic, very few in residential neighborhoods, which is great to see. But, so those are kind of the challenges that'll come with things, but it's good to see some options and hear how feasible some of these options could be, in these intersections as time goes on, so we can make these improvements.
Yeah. And you honed in on that well. And I would say that, I've looked at lots of crash data sets, and rear ends are basically always the number one crash, those are rarely resulting in significant injury. Not to say that they can't, but typically those are low on the injury spectrum. And you expect to see those in areas where there's more traffic and more congestion, and roundabouts are certainly good at removing the high risk crash types. I mean, I know there's a lot of studies on how much safer roundabouts are than other control types, especially at reducing the high injury crashes, because it does remove conflict points and it reduces speeds, and both of those kind of help. And the list and I know you guys have already seen the presentation, so you've seen kind of the slides where we talk about potential countermeasures. They're all geared primarily towards improving the pedestrian bicycle environment, but some of those will also mitigate some of these other, trends on these corridors. A mini roundabout that may reduce travel speeds, which makes it safer for peds, will also reduce travel speeds, which will make it less likely for cars to crash. I mean, there's not just one benefit to some of these improvements. And yeah, it is nice to see that these crashes are largely on the main thoroughfares and not in the local residential areas. And the few that were really seemed to have themes that were, unique to that particular instance, not even to that spot, but just the circumstance was kind of unique. And there wasn't really a lot of trend or data to suggest that it was vulnerable again. Having said that, we're not ignoring the spots that may not. So if I scroll back down to this graphic, there's a couple orange red circles that aren't showing up on these corridors. We're certainly not ignoring those. These purple lines would represent maybe our priority corridors, but we would certainly be looking at, are there spot improvements that make sense as countermeasures at these specific locations outside the corridors? And so we'll make that assessment, that we'll work with the city and decide, for this crash, was there a deficiency at the intersection that we can resolve with a countermeasure? And if so, it'll be on the list, in addition to these corridor wide, priority areas. So with having said all of that, again, we're still in the process of kind of honing in on what exactly we want to recommend, but these next few slides kind of discuss countermeasures that can address some of this specific issues that we're either seeing or hearing about. And so this, these mini roundabouts, which aren't necessarily the same as a legitimate roundabout controlled intersection, but can be located, especially in neighborhood corridors, as a way of calming speeds. The city has some speed signs that they've recently been able to locate in different corridors in the city, and they can run those in ghost mode so that they're recording speed data without actually flashing your speed and telling you you're going too fast, and then they can turn it on and then it will flash, oh, you're speeding, slow down. And then we've been able to get a little bit of that data to just kind of digest, are there some clear speeding issues on some of these main corridors? The data was limited to a short duration, but what we were seeing generally was turning the sign on didn't matter. People were driving the same before or after. And also that generally the spots that we checked there was obviously speeding, but there wasn't consistent speeding beyond what you would expect almost anywhere. However, going back up to here, the East Arcadia Avenue was one of the spots that a local resident has expressed concern about multiple times. So the city very recently was able to put these signs up there. And again, in a broader sense, we didn't see any consistent themes of speeding, but I believe the high speed recorded was 67. So that's an obscenely fast speed for any of the roads in the city, but for a neighborhood like that, it's hard to say how much you want to chase down that one driver that was feeling reckless, but an improvement like this would make that much more difficult to do. So this is one of the potential countermeasures we're kind of expecting to include as far as candidates in the systemic corridor improvement, almost like a menu. If we were on our corridor, what things could we consider depending on the spot? Another one, and this has come up a couple of times, from you guys, these curb extensions in areas where there's on-street parking to help minimize the crossing distance and also improve visibility. So these are really, really helpful in areas where there's on-street parking and multiple corridors that we've identified. I know, in downtown and also on Olympic Highway North, there is on-street parking space. So even if there's not cars parked in it, as soon as the pedestrian steps off the curb, they're now at risk. And so the longer that distance, the more exposure, the more risk there is. And Joe mentioned something to this effect too, that he doesn't like the crossings of the four lane roads. That goes straight to this point, that the longer you're exposed, the more likely it is that something can happen. And so this is one of the ways that you can reduce that exposure while also, maximizing the potential to be seen. Megan, I see a hand on your screen. Did you want to go ahead?
Just wondering, in your experience working with like other cities and downtown corridors and small towns like ours, have you seen additional designs like this with curb extensions to reduce the crossing distance, as well as like similar designs that extend like businesses out into parking areas to give them like outdoor seating and whatnot? Have you seen designs like that that have helped reduce like the amount of traffic, or the speed of traffic and whatnot? I recently was in Walla Walla, so that's why I asked about that. If you have all not been Walla Walla of late, they have several different opportunities for businesses to have even a removable type of situation like what you're seeing here with a curb extension. So Ryan, you got any?
So I would say specific to these curb extensions, yeah, these are a pretty common countermeasure that you'll see in downtown environments. And that's not necessarily an overly new trend. It's neat to hear your experience about the business element, because I haven't personally been involved in a project that implemented that, but I have sat in on multiple webinar discussions about that more emerging trend. And I know COVID and the need for outdoor dining really increased like the value of having these extensions of businesses to the outside environment, outside their street, their window, and kind of recapturing space that for a time, the roadway network has really been specific to serving vehicles. And I think there's more and more momentum to broadening the definition of what these roadway networks need to serve. And in a lot of times, that's the sort of treatment that can kind of recapture pavement for the businesses and the pedestrians, and maybe make the vehicles less of a priority. I think that, if you want to, considering those types of improvements is great. I think that they need to be in the right context. And, you don't want to necessarily, there's a trade-off to a degree in terms of vehicle throughput or parking that you have to kind of deal with if you want to have some of those treatments. And it's completely defensible to have like a policy-driven decision where we want to prioritize all modes of travel. And we acknowledge that vehicles may be slightly negatively impacted, but at the greater benefit of these other modes. But we making sure we understand the pros and the cons of the trade-offs, depending on if it was on railroad or first. South of railroad is essentially the state route. And so that's a different animal. And then north of there, there's context to be considered. But yeah, I think that's something that I don't have a slide for that, but that's a newer trend that could maybe be a great fit for certain parts of this town, of Shelton as well. So I'm going to make a note of that. They, in the webinars I was tuning in on, they were all presented by people that were seeing this done in their local communities, and Walla Walla was not presented, but it's really neat to hear about a local community here that's also doing those things. I know it's not right next door, but Walla Walla is not too far away.
They do wine tasting. We could do wine tasting and shellfish tasting.
I guess I don't know if it's the right time to kind of start talking about this, but I definitely like to talk more about prioritizing a project like this each year. I know we have some focus areas on roadway maintenance and improvements each year in our budget, but I'd like to consider prioritizing at least. Outside of the existing capital improvements, if we're doing other roadway improvements, I'm sure we're going to be resolving, we would resolve any safety issues at the time when we're doing that construction. But outside of that, if there's definitely areas that we can prioritize, a project or two a year amongst some of our residential paving and other types of stuff, I'd be interested in having conversations on which of these projects would be feasible. I know we have kind of a limited amount of funding we can kind of throw at this, but to even potentially adding similar projects to our legislative priorities. I know safe routes to schools was another opportunity through the TIB, for some of this type of stuff, but I think the data that you presented is was very helpful in wanting to try to tackle this one. So just throwing it out to the council.
I like that idea, Joe.
And so, yeah, that's great. And the last slide on this show, this presentation talks about next steps. And that's one of the key deliverables of this plan, is kind of coming up with not only the areas that need to be focused on, but a prioritization of those areas and or spot improvements. And so as part of this process, once we kind of finalize the countermeasures that we kind of want to run with, we're going to do some planning level cost estimates of what those would cost. And then that can also inform, are there some inexpensive fixes that could be done in the shorter term? And let's maybe prioritize some of those while we work on getting funding for some of the more expensive ones. So that's work to come. And the idea of the city trying to champion one or two of these every year sounds terrific. I know not unique to Shelton, but money is always difficult to find. And one of the pluses of this plan is it really positions you well to seek out funding sources. I mean, it's really hard to be competitive without a plan like this that identifies the need ahead of time. But once you have it, it really opens some doors. And I know Ken's well aware of those opportunities, and it's a big part of why this plan is such a good idea to complete. So, planter strip, this is kind of a little bit of a more generic improvement. Not only is exposure on the road increasing the risk, but having distance between the sidewalk and the road is another way to kind of increase safety. And a lot of these roads have on-street parking. So in a way, there's already this buffer built in between the traveling vehicles and the pedestrians. But planter strips, and in addition to, this goes a little beyond maybe the pure safety of it, but I know just in terms of assessing the performance of a sidewalk or the comfort level of a sidewalk, which tend to go hand in hand with how they perform, that having that extra buffer can go a long way towards making it feel more comfortable and usable. One of the problems that we've had in other jurisdictions where we've kind of done an assessment of pedestrian safety is when you're using existing crash data, and if the community understands, well, I would never walk there because it's wildly dangerous. And then there's no data because they already know it's dangerous and foolish. So you don't walk there, so you don't get crashes. And so there's no data to support a change. The idea behind the systemic improvements is to try to figure out those locations that maybe people don't walk because they're dangerous. But if we can use other locations as the mechanism to fund an improvement there, then that can help. Kathleen, go ahead.
Yes, I'm really interested in pervious paving for sidewalks. What is the lifespan of those versus cement sidewalks that we have now, and the durability of them? Would that be you off the top of your head?
At the top of my head, I have no idea.
Okay, all right.
That's a great question. So I am not an engineer, and that rings a lot of engineer bells in my head. I know there are people that I could quickly talk to that would give me a pretty quick answer to that. And Ken may have thoughts, I'm not to put him on the spot, but thoughts on the pros and cons of doing sidewalks with pervious surfaces instead of impervious. And that I mean, there's lots of pros and cons, or pros to that sort of thing. I guess, are you raising that comment specifically thinking about safety, or just thinking more broadly about the pedestrian network?
I'm looking at safety for one thing. I live downtown, so I walk around town a lot, and the cement sidewalks, are cracking and they're dangerous. So I'm just visual. I think it's pervious pavers are beautiful, I think. But safety wise, cost wise, I'm just curious about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's great. That's a great additional input. And that's something that we can kind of track down and figure out is does that make sense as we're rehabbing some of these sidewalks anyway? Does it make sense to convert to a different material that might make it more inviting. Because I think this goes beyond just making it safer. I think, we want to try to promote these modes as much as possible, and safety and just generally feeling comfortable are both part of that. So,
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Deidre.
oh, yeah, Deidre.
Ryan, just as a side note, I don't know if you've had a chance to look at the downtown visioning plan that the city worked with community stakeholders on, but there's some good insights there about pedestrian safety, obviously specific to the downtown core. But we've been trying to capture some of those elements within other capital projects and improvements. So it might be worthwhile kind of dovetailing those pieces as we move forward.
Yeah, well, that's great. When we started this, we had a kind of a kickoff with Ken and Jay, and it was a bombardment of resources. They were so excited to talk about what they knew and what they wanted this process to be, and a plethora of other documents and resources. So I haven't gone through that well enough yet, and I think now that we're at the stage we're at now, where we're kind of winnowing in on, we have kind of our broad priority areas, and we're considering countermeasures, and we're really going to dig in now to spot recommendations. I think that's the right time to really mesh and marry that to existing plans, and whatever overlap we can manage to get is great, and we don't need to reinvent priorities if there's already some great documented ones there. So that's a good reminder. It got mentioned earlier that the crossing for the junior high has got flashing lights, and so a way to kind of amplify the visibility and safety is to have a truly signalized pedestrian crossing, and RFB specific treatments are kind of shown to be much best performing in terms of vehicles adhering to them, or not enforcement, but success rate, I guess you would say, of the vehicles reacting, that RFBs specifically seem to have really good performance metrics for that. So I think, in specific spots, and I'm in the junior high crossing walk for sure, and potentially other locations in the city where there are these uncontrolled crossings in the middle of a potentially high volume corridor, I think this is a specific improvement we almost certainly expect to have in the plan as a systemic improvement, and then likely multiple specific spots where we would maybe advocate for this treatment. And then another one that kind of hits on a earlier comment, this idea of refuges in the middle of a roadway. So yeah, the 4-lane, even 3 lanes actually work really well for this sort of treatment, because you can install it in the existing 2-way left turn lane space. But the more travel lanes there are, the more exposure. So this is just, again, another tool in the toolbox for kind of reducing that amount of exposure. And I think this is one we would almost certainly expect to have in the plan as a systemic improvement. And then we'll be working with the city to figure out if there's specific spots we want to preemptively recommend this treatment for. So I think that's not the entire list of what we would potentially have in the plan, but those are some of the initial countermeasures that we've kind of honed in on, knowing that pedestrian and bicycle safety is the priority. As we kind of dig a little bit more into specific spots within the corridors that may be candidates for a recommended improvement, there could very well be other countermeasures that make sense. Those countermeasures that I kind of just walked through all feel like systemic improvements that can be kind of broadly considered on the corridors that we've identified as appropriate. Kind of like I said before, a menu of considerations, and I would expect likely most or all of those to be in the plan with a planning level cost estimate attached to them. The nice thing about those improvements is that by and large, their price tag is consistent regardless of where. The planner strip might be the one exception to that, but a lot of those other ones are really not going to cost more in one part of town or the other, versus some improvement types will depend on the specific, especially when there's right-of-way involved. If there's a right-of-way take needed, that dramatically changes the cost, and it would be specific to a spot. But most of those improvements we can kind of come up with a broad price tag for, and that'll be applicable wherever those improvements make sense. So we've kind of, I kind of inserted this slide in the narrative earlier where I was kind of asking for feedback. I've got a lot of notes here for some specific concerns or observed areas of interest, and that's exactly what we were hoping to get. A month or so ago, the plan initially was for me to come to the city of Shelton, meet with Ken and Jay, and then Jay was kind of putting feelers out to get maybe some local people to come, and he was having a hard time getting people interested in crash data and, I guess discussing this. So he kind of decided, hey, let's just go talk to council. They're all, residents, and they hear things maybe more than the average citizen anyway. So it's great to have the chance to talk to all of you and really hear some of the concerns that you either have or have picked up on through your relationships with the city. So then, this is the last slide, just talking about next steps. We've kind of talked about a lot of this already, but finalizing what we would consider to be the priority locations, depending on some of these other locations that have been discussed, we might have a hierarchy of like high priority and other priorities, because we're trying, as much as possible, we're trying to build this report on the data. And I think that the more data driven it is, the more competitive it becomes for funding. But we don't want to ignore any and all areas that are concerns, within the city. And there's certainly a place for them in this plan. And then also just kind of honing in on the exact countermeasures that we think we want to recommend, and then specifically going through and prioritizing locations or countermeasures that could be candidates for, short-term, implementation based on cost or need or both. And that will, that third bullet will be integral in that discussion with the city too. So that's kind of the next step. And it's kind of the last big effort before this plan is pulled together. So we're going to be working with the city on kind of finalizing locations and countermeasures, and then working through a prioritization of those countermeasures. And we would expect to finish the report and that process in the next couple of months. And then the idea being that we'll then try to get positioned for funding, specifically from WashDOT, for whatever funding sources are available. They're always going to be looking for where's the plan that proves that need or that shows that need. And so we'll have that plan. So that's kind of where we're headed. And I guess that's kind of all I had. So if there were any other comments or questions, it's been great to share this. And I love that everyone kind of had a chance to kind of share their own thoughts and concerns. And we're going to do everything we can to get all of those in here, because this plan is for Shelton, and whatever we can do to address all these issues, that's the whole point of this.
Sounds like to me that we need to prioritize pedestrian areas or downtown, and areas where their crosswalks are insufficient. And to me, it sounds like the pedestrians are the biggest problem right now. So that's where I would go. Yeah,
and that was the huge takeaway, was that is the problem, really, in terms of themes and trends. That was it. That the pedestrians and the bicyclists, and they're exposed, and they're the ones that are getting these fatal serious crashes. And even though the downtown core doesn't have the predominance of the fatal serious, they definitely have the predominance of overall collisions. And there are, and not to say they don't have fatal serious. So I totally agree. Pedestrian are the priority, and downtown is where the most of those are. So finding solutions for areas in the downtown area is definitely going to be one of, I think, the higher priorities of this plan.
All right. Any more questions for Ryan? Okay, thank you, Ryan.
Absolutely. It was great to meet all of you and to share where we're at.
Hey, Ryan, I have one question for you.
Sure.
Oh,
This has nothing to do with the city corridor traffic. You went to Tenino High School, right?
I did.
What year did you graduate?
2003.
Okay, just wondering.
Ryan also attended St. Martin's while I was there and was very active with the disc golf club. So I think he probably has seen some special features here in Shelton that are appealing along the way.
Yep. When I saw your face show up, I was like, oh man, I don't want to say the way back, because it wasn't that long ago, but it kind of was that we were in college. Yep.
Minute, different last name, I know.
Yes, that was the pause, but I was convinced that it didn't matter. Yep, I knew that face.
See you.
All right, council. Does council have any more items for discussion tonight? Seeing none. This study session is adjourned at 7:04.